My name is Margaret Thornfield, and I'm 75 years old. 3 weeks ago, I received the most beautiful wedding invitation in the mail, cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing. The kind that costs $40 each. The venue was listed as the Grandview Estate, Millbrook Heights. My heart swelled with pride as I read it, thinking my daughter Vivian had finally found happiness after her messy divorce years ago. But then I read the names, Marcus Chen and Vivian Whitmore Reynolds, no mention of parents, no MR, and Mrs. Thornfield request the honour of your presence, nothing. And when I called Vivian that evening, excited to discuss the details, she delivered the blow that would change everything between us. Mother, I'm sorry, but this is going to be a small, intimate ceremony, just close friends. We're keeping the guest list very limited. The silence that followed felt like a chasm opening between us. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to know that this story gets more shocking with every twist. If you've ever been excluded by your own family or felt underestimated because of your age, please hit that subscribe button. Your support means everything. And if you have your own story about family betrayal, share it in the comments below. Trust me, after you hear what Vivian did next, you'll have plenty to say. Now, let me take you back to that devastating phone call. I was standing in the sunroom of my Beacon Hill townhouse, the one my late husband Richard and I had called home for 49 years. The afternoon light filtered through the antique glass, casting rainbows across the Persian rug where Vivian had taken her first steps, that same daughter who now couldn't find room for her own mother at her wedding. But sweetheart, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, surely there's space for your mother. I've been dreaming of walking you down the aisle since. Mother, please don't make this harder than it already is. Vivian's voice had that sharp edge she'd developed during her corporate lawyer years. Marcus's family is very traditional. They have specific ideas about ceremonies, and we're respecting their customs. Marcus, I'd met him only twice. A perfectly polite investment banker from old Portland money. The kind of man who wore $1,000 suits and talked about portfolio diversification over dinner. But there was something in his eyes when he looked at Vivian that reminded me of a hawk circling prey. What customs prevent a mother from attending her daughter's wedding? I asked. It's complicated, Mother. Marcus thinks. Well, he thinks it might be better if we start fresh, no baggage from previous marriages or complicated family dynamics. Complicated family dynamics, that's what I'd become to my own daughter. A complication. After hanging up, I sat in Richard's old chair, the leather worn smooth from decades of his evening reading. I thought about how he'd always said Vivian had inherited his business sense, but my stubborn streak, that girl will either build an empire or burn one down. He'd joke, hopefully not both. As I sat there, something nagged at me about that wedding venue, the Grandview Estate in Millbrook Heights. I'd heard that name before, but couldn't place it. At 75, my memory sometimes played tricks on me, but certain names, certain places, they stick like thorns. The next morning, I was organizing Richard's old business files, a task I'd been avoiding for the 3 years since his passing. My attorney, James Morrison, had been after me to consolidate the estate documents, and frankly, I needed the distraction from Vivian's wedding snub. That's when I found the manila folder labeled Investment Properties, Millbrook Development Corp. My heart stopped. Inside were deeds, purchase agreements, and development contracts dating back to 1987. Richard had bought 73 acres of undeveloped land in what was then a sleepy corner of New Hampshire, about 2 hours north of Boston, the Grandview Estate. My Richard had developed that property. I called James immediately. James, I need you to pull up the current status of the Millbrook Heights development. Margaret, you own 49% of that property through the Thornfield Family Trust. He said after some rustling of papers, the other 51% belongs to Millbrook Development Corp., but they've been trying to buy you out for years. Didn't Richard ever mention it? Richard, always protecting me from the boring business details, he'd set up the trust to provide steady income, but I'd never paid attention to where the quarterly checks came from. $15,000 every 3 months for 37 years. I'd assumed it was from his old textile investments, James, who runs Millbrook Development Corp. now. More papers rustling. Let me see. Acquired in 2018 by Chen Holdings LLC. The principal owner is, he paused, Marcus Chen, my future son-in-law. The man who thought I was too much baggage for his perfect wedding. The same man who'd been trying to buy out my share of the property where he planned to marry my daughter. The irony was delicious, but the betrayal cut deep. This wasn't about intimate ceremonies or cultural customs. This was about Marcus trying to cut me out of both my daughter's life and my own property. I spent the rest of that week making phone calls and doing research that would have impressed my late husband. It turns out Marcus had been quietly acquiring properties around Millbrook Heights for years, turning the area into an exclusive wedding and event destination. The Grandview estate was the crown jewel, a stunning colonial manor he'd renovated into a luxury venue, but he couldn't touch it without my 49% on Thursday. I drove to Vivian's law office in downtown Boston. Her secretary, a sweet girl named Amanda, tried to tell me Vivian was in court, but I'd already confirmed she was in her office through a well-placed call to her assistant. "Hello, sweetheart," I said. Walking into her corner office with its view of Boston Harbor, Vivian looked up from her computer, startled. "Mother, you can't just barge in here. I have clients." "No clients today, darling." I checked. I sat down across from her, placing my leather purse carefully on my lap. "I wanted to talk to you about your wedding venue." Something flickered in her eyes, nervousness. "Maybe guilt. What about it?" "The Grandview estate is lovely. I've heard wonderful things about the gardens. Tell me, how did Marcus find such an exclusive location?" Vivian relaxed slightly. "Oh. He's had connections to that property for years. His family has history there." "History." I nodded thoughtfully. That's one word for it. Another word might be business interest. Now she was definitely nervous. "What do you mean?" I opened my purse and pulled out a copy of the property deed. "I mean that your fiancé has been trying to buy out my share of that property for the past 6 years. I mean that every quarterly payment I've received for decades comes from rental fees and event bookings at the Grandview estate. I mean, sweetheart, that I co-own your wedding venue." The color drained from Vivian's face. That's not possible. "Your father was many things, but he wasn't careless with investments." I leaned forward. "Now, would you like to explain to me why my future son-in-law never mentioned this little coincidence? Or why I'm suddenly complicated family baggage when before this engagement, I was simply your mother?" Vivian's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, and I saw Marcus's name on the screen. She declined the call, but her hands were shaking. "Marcus doesn't know you're here, does he?" I asked. "Mother, please, you don't understand how complicated this situation is. Then explain it to me." But Vivian just stared out the window at the harbor. And I realized my daughter, my brilliant, fierce daughter, was scared. Not nervous, not embarrassed, scared. That's when I knew this was bigger than a wedding snub or a business coincidence. That evening, I called James Morrison at home. "James, I need you to draft something for me. Make it look official. Law firm. Letterhead, the whole production. Margaret, what are you planning?" "I'm going to give Marcus exactly what he wants, or at least, I'm going to make him think I am." The document James prepared was a letter of intent to sell my 49% share of the Grandview estate to Chen Holdings LLC for $3 million. significantly below market value. The catch was that the sale would only go through after a family reconciliation period of 60 days, during which all parties would demonstrate good faith efforts to resolve any outstanding personal conflicts. In other words, if Marcus wanted to buy my share of his precious wedding venue, he was going to have to play nice with his future mother-in-law for 2 months. James included a provision that the wedding could proceed as planned, with my blessing, as long as I was included as an honored family member in the ceremony. He made it sound like the ramblings of a sentimental old woman who just wanted to see her daughter get married. The genius was in the details. The letter mentioned that I'd been feeling isolated from family and hoped this business arrangement could bridge personal gaps. It painted me as a lonely widow willing to practically give away a valuable asset just to feel included. Marcus would see exactly what he expected to see, a weak-old woman he could manipulate. I had James deliver the letter to Marcus's office on Monday morning, with copies sent to Vivian and Marcus's business attorney. By noon, my phone was ringing. "Mrs. Thornfield, this is Marcus Chen. I believe we need to talk." His voice was smooth, confident, the voice of a man who thought he'd just won the lottery. "Of course, dear. Why don't you come by the house for tea tomorrow afternoon, 2 o'clock? Actually, I was hoping we could meet somewhere more neutral, perhaps my office." "Oh, Marcus, I'm too old for downtown traffic. Besides, if we're going to be family, you should see where Vivian grew up." The pause told me everything. He didn't want to come to my house because houses hold memories, photographs, evidence of relationships that predate him. But he needed that property deed, so he'd swallow his discomfort, of course. "Mrs. Thornfield, I'll see you at 2. Marcus arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a smile that never reached his eyes. I served tea in the front parlor, the same room where Richard had proposed to me 53 years earlier. "Mrs. Thornfield, I want you to know how much I appreciate this gesture," Marcus began, settling into Richard's old chair without invitation. "Vivian has been so stressed about the wedding planning. And knowing her mother supports our union, well, it means everything to us, does it?" I poured tea into Richard's favorite china cups, because when Vivian called to uninvite me from the wedding, she seemed to think you preferred I not attend. Marcus's smile flickered. "I think there's been a misunderstanding, Vivian. She's been under a lot of pressure lately, the merger at her firm, planning the wedding, dealing with her ex-husband's custody demands. Sometimes she says things she doesn't mean." "What merger?" Another flicker. "Did I say merger? I meant the partnership track. She's being considered for partner." But I'd already caught him in the lie. Vivian had made partner 3 years ago, which meant either Marcus didn't know his fiancée as well as he claimed, or he was lying about something else entirely. "Marcus, may I ask you something directly?" "Of course. When did you first realize I owned part of the Grandview estate?" He set down his teacup carefully. Well, when my attorney reviewed the property records for the wedding contract, your name came up as a partial owner. It was quite a surprise." "I imagine it was. And when did you share this surprise with Vivian?" We discussed it when it came to light." "Which was when, exactly?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically see him calculating how much truth he could afford to tell me. "Mrs. Thornfield, I want to be honest with you. Yes, I've known about your ownership stake for some time. My company has been hoping to acquire full ownership of the property for development purposes. When I met Vivian and learned she was your daughter, I'll admit I saw it as an opportunity to approach you through family channels rather than corporate ones." The casual way he said it, "I saw it as an opportunity," sent a chill through me. "You mean you pursued my daughter because of a business deal?" No, that's not. I mean, I genuinely care for Vivian. But when I realized the family connection, I thought perhaps we could handle the property situation more personally, more amicably." By excluding me from the wedding, Marcus shifted. In his chair, that was Vivian's idea. Actually, she thought it would be easier to approach you about the property sale after the honeymoon, when things had settled down. She didn't want you to think we were mixing business with personal matters, everything. Clicked into place, Vivian hadn't suddenly decided I was unwelcome at her wedding. She'd been convinced by Marcus that keeping me away was somehow protective, that I couldn't handle the stress of knowing about the business connection. But there was still something missing from this picture. Marcus, help me understand something. You're clearly successful, your family has money. Why is this particular property so important to you? For the first time since he'd arrived, Marcus's composure cracked completely, because it's not just about the wedding venue, Mrs. Thornfield. The Grandview estate sits on the only undeveloped waterfront in that entire region. If I can acquire full ownership, I can build a luxury resort that would be worth 20 times what I'd pay you for your share. But I can't touch it, can't even secure the financing, without controlling interest. There it was, the truth. This had never been about wedding venues or family dynamics. Marcus needed my 49% to unlock a development deal, worth millions, and Vivian, does she know about the resort plans? Marcus's silence was answer enough. I asked Marcus to invite Vivian over for dinner that evening so we could finalize the family arrangements together. He readily agreed, probably thinking he was about to witness me sign away millions of dollars. In exchange for a seat at their wedding, Vivian arrived at 6, looking more tired than I'd seen her since her divorce. She hugged me, the first real hug we'd shared in months, and whispered, "Thank you for being so understanding about everything." Mom, my heart broke a little more. We sat in the dining room, the three of us, with Richard's portrait watching. From above the sideboard, I'd prepared a simple meal, roast chicken, the way I used to make it when Vivian was young, but none of us were really eating. Before I sign anything, I said finally, I want to make sure I understand exactly what I'm agreeing to. Marcus pulled out the purchase agreement he'd had his attorney prepare. It's straightforward, Mrs. Thornfield. You sell your 49% share to Chen Holdings for $3 million. The sale closes 30 days after the wedding, giving us all time to adjust to being family. And then what happens to the property? What do you mean? I mean, what are your long-term plans for the Grandview estate? Marcus glanced at Vivian, who was staring at her plate. We'll continue operating it as a premier event venue. Of course, it's a beautiful property with a lot of potential. Potential for what, specifically? Mother, Vivian said quietly, does it matter? You'll be well compensated, and you will be part of our family. Isn't that what's important? I reached across the table and took my daughter's hand. Sweetheart, what would you say if I told you that Marcus plans to tear down the Grandview estate and build a luxury resort on the property? Vivian's head snapped up. What? That's not, Marcus. That's not true, is it? Marcus's face had gone very still. Vivian, there are always multiple development options for any property. That doesn't mean, is it true? She demanded. The resort development is one possible future use of the property. Yes, but that would be years down the line, and only if market conditions. You lied to me. Vivian's voice was barely a whisper. You told me we'd be preserving the estate. You said that's why it was so important to have the wedding there, to honor the history of the place. Vivian, please, how long have you known about my mother's ownership stake? Marcus was quiet. How long, Marcus? Since before we met, he admitted finally. I'd been researching property owners in the area. When I saw your name come up as Margaret Thornfield's daughter, I looked you up. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my daughter's face cycle through disbelief, hurt, and finally, a cold fury I recognized from her father. You researched me, she said, like a business deal. It wasn't like that when I met you. Everything changed. I fell in love with you, Vivian. The property became secondary. Secondary enough that you convinced me to disinvite my own mother from our wedding. That was 2. Protect her. I didn't want her to feel pressured. You didn't want her to ask questions. Vivian stood up from the table. You didn't want her to find out that you'd been planning this from the beginning. She turned to me. Mom, I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry. I stood and wrapped my arms around my daughter. She felt small and fragile, the way she had when she was 7 and had fallen off her bicycle. It's okay, sweetheart, it's going to be okay. Over Vivian's shoulder, I looked at Marcus. I think, you should leave now, Mrs. Thornfield. Vivian, please, let's not make any hasty decisions. We can work this out. No, Vivian said, pulling away from me, but keeping hold of my hand. We can't, because I could never marry someone who would use me to steal from my mother. I'm not stealing anything. I'm offering fair market value for a property worth 20 times that amount, I said calmly, for a property you can't develop without my share, which means my share is worth considerably more than you're offering. And even if it weren't, Vivian added, you lied to both of us. You manipulated me into pushing away my mother, and you tried to manipulate her into giving up her financial security. Marcus's polite mask finally slipped completely. You don't understand business, Vivian. This is how deals work. This is how successful people think. No, Vivian said, this is how selfish people think. This is how people think when they value money more than relationships. She pulled off her engagement ring and set it on the table. The wedding is off, Marcus, all of it. After Marcus left, and after Vivian and I had both had a good cry, we spent the evening in the sunroom, talking the way we used to when she was in college and would come home stressed about exams or boyfriends. I can't believe I almost married him, she said, curled up in the window seat with a cup of tea. I can't believe I chose him over you. You didn't choose him over me, sweetheart. You thought you were protecting me. But I should have seen it. I should have known when he started suggesting I was too close to you, too dependent on family approval. He was isolating me, wasn't he? I nodded. Classic manipulation tactic. Make you feel like your natural relationships are somehow unhealthy so you'll rely on him instead. How did you know? How did you see through him when I couldn't? I smiled, because I'm your mother, and I'm 75 years old. I've seen every kind of con man there is, and they all have the same tell. They're always in a hurry. Legitimate people don't pressure you to cut ties with family. Legitimate people don't try to rush you into life-changing decisions. We talked until nearly midnight about everything, about her marriage to David and why it had failed, about her career and whether she was truly happy, about my loneliness since Richard died, and how I'd been afraid to burden her with it. I want you to keep the property, Mom, she said finally. Don't sell it to Marcus or anyone else. Keep it as it is. Actually, I have a different idea. I pulled out the folder James had prepared for me earlier that week. I'm thinking about transferring my share to a family trust, with you as the primary trustee. Her eyes widened. Mom, I can't accept that. It's worth millions. And what good are millions to a 75-year-old woman if she can't share them with the person she loves most? But what about your security? What about Vivian? I have more money than I know what to do with. Your father left me very well provided for. And I've been getting quarterly payments from this property for decades without even realizing it. What I need isn't financial security, it's family security. I handed her the trust documents. This way, you'll have the income from the property. And someday it will pass to your children or their children. But more importantly, no one will ever be able to use it to manipulate either of us again. Are you sure? I'm sure that your father would be proud of how you handled yourself tonight. I'm sure that you're the smartest, strongest woman I know, and I'm sure that whatever happens next in your life, you won't have to face it alone 6 months later. Vivian and I travelled to Scotland together, a trip we'd been planning since she was 15, but had never found time for. We spent 2 weeks exploring castles and small villages, talking to locals, and discovering that the Thornfield family had originated in a tiny town called Millbrook in the Scottish Highlands. The irony wasn't lost on either of us on our last night in Edinburgh, as we sat in a pub that had been serving travellers since 1642. Vivian raised her glass to mothers who protect their daughters, even when their daughters are too foolish to realise they need protecting, and to daughters who are brave enough to choose love over money. I replied, even when it's terrifying. Especially when it's terrifying. We clinked glasses, and I realised that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting back at the people who hurt you. It's building something better with the people who matter. Marka still sends lawyers letters, occasionally trying to find new angles to acquire the Grandview estate. We donate them to the local historical society for their files on aggressive development attempts. They've become quite a collection. As for Vivian, she's dating a high school teacher named Robert who coaches girls' soccer and makes her laugh until her sides hurt. When I asked her what she likes most about him, she said, "He thinks it's wonderful that I'm close to my mother. That's how you know you've found the right person. They don't try to separate you from the people who love you. They celebrate those connections." And the Grandview estate, it's still hosting weddings every weekend. Just as Richard originally envisioned, the quarterly payments still arrive like clockwork. And now they go into a college fund for the grandchildren I hope to have someday. But more importantly, every time I drive past that beautiful colonial manor with its rolling lawns and lake views, I remember the weekend my daughter chose family over money, truth over comfort, and love over fear. That's worth more than any resort could ever be. If you've ever been underestimated because of your age, or if you've faced family members who tried to manipulate you out of what's rightfully yours, I hope my story gives you hope. Sometimes the people who seem most powerful are actually the most desperate. And sometimes the wisdom that comes with age is the greatest weapon we have. If you've experienced a similar situation where family loyalty was tested, please share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear how you handled it, and perhaps we can share your story in a future video. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about family, justice, and the strength that comes from standing up for what's right.